Lucy, it's so great to have you here. I've been waiting for this.
Oh,
I still feel like I'm talking to a celebrity every time I speak to you. I know I told you that already, but
it's
it's
hilarious. It's hilarious to me.
and I've been talking to you like for months now.
Yeah, I know. I know.
You are an inspiration that
Oh,
I can't tell you that enough. You are the reason I'm doing this podcast now, because you
oh.
give me the nudge I needed. So my first question is, were you always an optimist? So I know the answer, but
No, I wasn't. What a great question to start with because I definitely was not always an optimist. In fact, if anything, I was always much more of a pessimist. I was always quite cynical and I would always tend to sort of see the like downsides and see the negative. And I have literally trained myself to be an optimist. I mean, you know all about my sort of journey of personal growth, and it's the last 4 or 5 years of my life that things kind of came to a head, and I basically got so sick of my own bullshit, and I got so sick of living a life that I knew wasn't enough for me. And I just made a decision. I literally made a decision that I was going to change my life and take my power back and get control back over my life and my thoughts. Because at the end of the day, it is all down to well, so much of life. I say this all the time, but so much of how we feel, our experience of the world, our experience of life, it's down to the lens that we're seeing it, that we're looking through. And that used to be for me a much more pessimistic and cynical lens. But as I say, I've literally, I guess you could say that I have rewired my brain to be a much more optimistic, positive, very much forward looking, opportunity finding, and goodness believing type person. So yeah, but I'm glad you asked that question because it's an interesting one, isn't it?
yeah, and I told you you inspired me because I went through the same thing. I my default, you always talk about your default being, and I was
Yeah,
so pessimist. Everything was wrong. I was a victim of the world.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I choose to. And it's simple and it's hard work, but it's so worth it.
Totally. And that's the thing. It is work, but it's like you say, it is totally worth it. And I heard somebody say, I can't remember whether it was a reel on Instagram or on a podcast, but I heard somebody say the other day that it's a lot easier. It's much easier to be negative than it is to be it's harder to be
Yeah.
positive. It's harder work to be positive, and it's so easy to be really complainy and negative and down on life and down on everything. Because actually, I think that's what so many people tend to be like. And I think we kind of just the way that we've been conditioned, I guess, and the way that humans are just inherently, it's we tend to, that we have that sort of negativity bias. But picking up what you said about living in victimhood, this is something that I feel so passionately about. And I know it can be a very triggering subject, but the reason I feel like I can talk about it is because I used to be that person. I used to be
Mm.
such a victim. And like you just said, it is that I would blame everything outside of myself. It was always the fault of my job or the fault of where I lived or the fact that I didn't have enough money or this or that or the other. I was always finding reasons outside of myself as to why my life wasn't how I wanted it to look. And it was only when I started exploring the world of self development that I just finally realized that actually the problem was me. And the problem was the way that I was thinking about my life and the world. Um, but I think I know only too well that when you are living in that victim mentality, when you are so wedded to that story in your mind, it's incredibly difficult to pull yourself out of that. And I think you have to kind of, like I said earlier, you almost have to just get so sick of yourself that you're like, oh my God, I need to make a change because I'm not happy and I need to do something to change my life. And that I think is when people often, you've kind of got to hit that sort of, or sometimes you've got to hit that rock bottom to start to climb out of that into hopefully a better, more optimistic life and mindset.
Yeah, and you need perseverance and
Definitely.
compassion to yourself every time you fall into your old patterns of victimhood. Because
Yeah.
for me, at least, it is still a working process.
Same.
So yeah, but I think, like you said, it's so worth. Because
Totally. But like, and it is a constant work in progress. This is
yeah,
stuff that, and it is something that from the podcast and just from knowing me, like it's something I have to work on every single day, like every single day. And but it is totally worth it. But yeah, it's I think it's a lifetime commitment, really. It is a lifetime's commitment to, you don't just suddenly sort of reach a point where you're like, I'm here, I've arrived, and everything's wonderful. You have to keep working at it. And like anyone else, I fall out of it as well. I fall back into victimhood on a regular basis. I can easily fall back into that negative way of thinking, easily, because that is more my default. Although I
yeah,
say that, but actually, I think I've managed to retrain my brain so that actually, even though I do fall into, of course, fall into negativity on a regular basis still, actually, my brain is now wired to automatically come back to the positive because that's the way that I've programmed my brain to work for me so that it serves me rather than works against me.
yeah, that happens to me too. That I I feel like I have an alarm like, no, that's not the path we are going, not, you know?
Totally, totally.
Like the little cricket in Pinocchio
Yes, I know. Oh my God,
screaming
I
at
feel like
me,
that's my
no,
favorite.
not that way.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah.
totally.
So how did you start? You told me you had reached rock bottom, but what book, what video, what made you like snap out of the victim mentality, you know? So
Well,
I know
funny
what
enough,
what was for me. I was invited to a group meditation, and they started talking about choosing your mentality, and I said, like, I can't do that. I never thought
yeah,
it was an option.
yeah. Well, it's so funny because to cut a very long story short, you know this story, I won't bore you with it. But so I, for many years, worked at BBC Radio 2 because music has always been my passion. So I'd sort of naturally gravitated into a job that involved music. And then I was in a really not good relationship with a guy that I'd met through my job at Radio 2. Not he doesn't work at Radio 2, but I'd met him in that world. And off the back of that, so basically I was in a really, really, really bad place in this relationship. Like I was, it really was not a great relationship. It was very, very, very toxic. And I mean, I was only with him for about 2.5 years, but I should have left. And for at least a year and a half of that only 2.5 year relationship, I knew that I had to get out, but I just didn't find the strength until I did. But basically, what happened was that I ended up leaving my job at the BBC to go and become a detective of all things in the Met Police in London. And which is hilarious because basically I never ever had any desire to go into the police, like at all. But I had always quite fancied the idea of being a detective. And at the time, this relationship was so, so, so bad, and I was kind of looking for a way out, and it might have been a slightly extreme way out, but I knew that if I left my job at the BBC, then I would no longer be in that world, and I could kind of get away from this guy. So that's what I did, and anyway, that job as a detective, I hated it. And I only did it for about a year and a half ish. And I knew from the minute I went in there that it was wrong for me. But as I say, to cut a long story short, I ended up leaving. Well, I actually ended up being signed off by my doctor because I got sick, and mentally and physically
Mm.
I wasn't well. By that point, I'd left that relationship. So I'd been single for God, however long at that point. Anyway, I got signed off by my GP, and this was at the very beginning of lockdown. And actually, the minute that I got signed off, I knew that I was never going to go back. In my heart, I knew that I was never going to go back. But I had this time because I was actually on sick pay for a few
Yeah.
months. And for the first time in my life, like literally the first time in my entire adult life, I had some time that I'd never had before. Like, just, we were in lockdown, no one was doing anything. I was on my own at home, and, I just had time to think, I had time to breathe. And at that time, I randomly, this was the sort of beginning of my journey of sort of entrepreneurship, if you like. I thought, right, what am I going to do? How am I going to make money? What am I going to do? Like, I knew that I knew that I didn't want to go back to another office job that I didn't want, that I didn't care about. I knew that I didn't want to work for somebody else. I just knew that I wanted to do things differently. So I was literally like looking around for things to do. And I ended up randomly, um, very, very temporarily becoming an Amazon seller, which literally I did only for a few months. And I did it, but I did a course, and it was an online course. And there were quite a lot of other people on this course. And I met quite a few people on that course. And we used to have these daily calls, and we used to have these daily calls with this American bloke who, do you know what? I can't even remember his name, but he would talk all about sort of mindset and how important it is to, get in the right mindset, da 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 da. And I suppose, looking back, I had always kind of been drawn to mindset and sort of a little bit of spirituality here and there, but I'd never sort of really investigated it, or I'd never really gone down that road because life kind of got in the way. But it was something that was always sort of there, but I just hadn't fully explored it. Anyway, so I started reading, but I actually read, before this, I think it was, I read a book by a guy called Hal Elrod, which was called The Miracle Morning. And I started a morning routine off the back of this. And I've definitely talked about this on the podcast, but basically, my morning routine was kind of the beginning of me changing my life. And this is why I talk about morning routines being just the best thing ever, because when you kind of take back your mornings, you take back your life to an extent. And I just started going down this road of personal growth and development. And I remember reading a book called The Power of Consistency by a guy called Weldon Long. I read The Miracle Morning. I read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So many books. And that was really the beginning of my journey to just really changing my life. But yeah, it started with randomly an Amazon course. That was how I kind of, yeah, started on that journey, I suppose. And here I am, like 4 or 5 years later. Yeah.
You kind of answered my next question was how do you started Strive Solo? Because
Oh gosh. Well, Thrive Solo is my membership community, as you know, because you've been in it. My membership community for single women, but that started several years later because
I thought this story you told and I can't say the word, you being an entrepreneur.
entrepreneur. I can't say that word.
My English doesn't go there, you know. So I thought that was it.
Well, no, because what happened was that so I was doing the Amazon thing for a bit, but then I became a barista in a coffee shop. I got a part-time job in a coffee shop, and I became my sister's cleaner So I was basically working part-time in a coffee shop and part-time as my sister's cleaner. So that is how was initially earning money when I'd kind of walked away from the detective job and I was just going, holy fuck, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to earn money? The Amazon thing sort of fizzled out. It was a nightmare. If anyone's thinking about doing it, don't do it. Well, you can if you want, but I would never go back there. But anyway, so I was literally, and again, we're in the middle of or the sort of early days of lockdown, and I was literally thinking, shit, how am I going to make money? So I started off by getting this job in the coffee shop, cleaning my sister's house, and that is when I decided actually to write a book about being single and not having kids, because at that point, the whole being single and child free thing it never even occurred to me. Like literally, it never crossed my mind to talk about that or, go into that space and certainly not start a podcast about it. It just hadn't occurred to me at all. Um, but I had this weird kind of, not weird, but sort of enlightened moment one July afternoon. I was sitting outside my flat on a bench and I remember I was reading through some WhatsApp messages. I always tell the story, but it's the truth. I was reading through some WhatsApp messages with some very good friends of mine, all of whom are like married with kids. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I feel so kind of smug that I'm single and I don't have kids.
Mm.
And then literally in that moment, I had this sort of revelation. I was like, oh my God, I need to, I need to write about how great it is to be single and not have kids, because in that moment I really felt like, and I think it almost occurred to me for the very first time, consciously anyway, that how crazy it was that there's this narrative around single women of a certain age who are supposed to be kind of miserable and, desperate for a bloke and blah blah blah. And I just was not that girl. I was like, happy I'd kind of come out of this relationship and I was feeling really good about my life and good about myself, even though I was working in a coffee shop and cleaning my sister's house. I was feeling like, in many ways, really kind of like freer than I had for a
Yeah.
long, long time. And so I actually started to type on my laptop, this very laptop that I'm on now. I just started to type. And I started writing this book about being single and not having kids. And then subsequently, a few months later, because that was in the July, in the November, so I kind of wrote furiously for 3 months. Um, and then in the sort of November, I decided to start a podcast. And that is how the podcast came about. The podcast didn't actually start until February 2022. And then a year later, I started Thrive Solo. So I wasn't, you know, in the very, because podcasting, unless you're somebody very famous with millions and millions of followers, podcasting is a long game. You have to be, I think you have to be really consistent. You have to keep showing up. You have to be patient. You don't suddenly start making millions of pounds from podcasting after three
Mm.
months. Do you know what I mean? And I think I always just knew that. I always knew that when I made the decision to start a podcast, I knew that I was going to commit to that and I wasn't just going to do it for 5 minutes and go, oh, this isn't working. I knew, and I sort of inherently understood that it just doesn't work like that. So Thrive Solo came a lot later. I didn't start Thrive Solo until, well, only a year, not even a year and a half ago. It was last July that it started officially, July 2023. So yeah, here we are.
For me, that I'm in Tribe Solo, it seems like you're been doing the group for years because you have this the gears fit and you are always there, you are present and you're in
Thanks.
every meeting and you are really mindful of we need to find another book for this month or it it seems like it's a walk in the park for you. So I thought it Tribe Solo had,
I
I don't
wouldn't
know,
say
5 years.
that.
But it
It
feels like that.
Well, I'm glad you say that and I appreciate that. So thank you. But I mean it's been a very steep learning curve for me. I mean, yeah, again, I only started it, nearly a year and a half ago, but it has been it's been hard because apart from anything else, when I started Thrive Solo and I started, running these Zoom calls, like I was fucking terrified. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't, to be honest. But I think the thing is actually that when you are doing something that feels really aligned and feels like what you are meant to be doing, and I have to say that I feel with the podcast and with the membership, it feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. This is and I would never have guessed that, even 5 years ago, I would never have guessed that my career would turn into being about being single and not having kids. It just would never have occurred to me
Yeah.
in a million years. And yet here I am. So thanks that you're very kind to say that. But it's definitely from my perspective, it's been a journey. It really, really has. And like I say, when I first started doing the live calls, just managing live calls with lots of different personalities, and you don't know how much people are going to engage. You don't, you have to keep the conversation going. You don't know, like some people talk a lot, some people never talk. It's a whole kind of dance that I've learned to deal with. But it actually, I talk about this a lot on the podcast as well, that so much of I think so much of the sort of fabulousness of life lies on the other side of our comfort zone, lies on the other side of fear. If we don't do things that scare us, then we're never going to move. Like we're just going to stay the same. And certainly this journey with the podcast and the membership and other things that have sort of happened as a result of the podcast, all of this has required me to hugely face up to feeling really scared a lot of the time, like a lot of the time, feeling really uncomfortable, but making myself do the things that made me feel uncomfortable. So yeah, again, you're very kind to say that, but it's definitely I'm glad it comes across like that.
I have my childless group, and I started the podcast like 3 months ago, and I have those fears too. And that's why I see you and you're managing all our personalities, the one that pop ups in the middle of the meeting with the microphone on and the camera off in the supermarket because it happened, and you manage so gratefully. I still like struggle to, what do I do with this, So yeah, I get that, but I also didn't, never thought about being out there, like being childless, not by choice, can be awesome. But I
Mm,
felt it, it was a message I needed to say. And like
yeah,
when I found you, I always show in our meetings that I'm single by choice. And when I found you and this optimistic and happy intake of I'm single and my life is wonderful, it was like I want to be with her, talk to her, and
mm,
embrace that, because I feel we have the responsibility to change the narrative.
yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I love the fact that you said that the community throughout the Thrive Solo community is feels like a sort of a positive space, and actually that is exactly what I wanted it to be. What I did not want it to be was a place for single women to come and be miserable and moan and
And
complain
Wolof, yeah.
24/7. Yeah, and whilst of course we talk about the difficulties, but there is a very, there is a way of doing that without sitting in that vibe all the time. And because I think and again, going back to mindset, I think when it comes to being single and having kids, so much of our experience is about how we choose to look at our lives and what we choose to make of our lives. And one thing I will say is that I think we because of all the conditioning in society and everything else, we think that being single and childless is like the worst thing because we think we're meant to be in relationship, we think we're meant to have kids. And of course, for many women, they're childless by circumstances, not by choice. And that's a whole thing in itself. And I wouldn't in any way want to undermine that. That's huge. And of course, there are many, many, many women out there who have gone through a lot of grief and continue to
Mm.
go through a lot of grief around that. And actually, as you know, I've had my own amount of grief about not having kids because I'm also childless by certain, I would say I'm childless not by choice, but I'm childless by circumstance. It never happened. I never made it happen. It just kind of didn't happen. And here I am. But the point I'm making, or the point I'm trying to make very inarticulately, is that of course we have to feel the sadness that we need to feel. We have to allow ourselves to move through the grief if that's how we feel about not having kids or being single. However, I think there has to come a point where we have to realize that moving forward, we do have a choice.
Yes.
And again, to reiterate, I'm not saying that many women don't feel an awful lot of grief. Again, I have felt grief myself, but I really do believe that when you've moved through that grief, you can either tell that story for the rest of your life, like I am childless and therefore my life is shit because I didn't have kids.
Yeah.
My life is shit because I always wanted kids. It was the thing that I wanted, and because I haven't had them, the rest of my life is shit. And we can keep telling ourselves that story over and over and over again if we want.
Yeah.
Or we can realize that that is not going to serve us and we can start telling a different story, just gently and slowly, but we can start telling a different story and we can start to look at it through a different lens because ultimately it does come down to a choice. And that's really can be incredibly difficult for people to hear when they're in the depths of their grief, particularly
Yeah.
when it comes to childlessness. And I totally get that. But I think once you've moved through that grief, and it's not necessarily something that you get over and one day you're
Yeah.
suddenly fine. You know, of course, like I still get pangs of like, oh my God, I want a baby. Like my brother recently had a baby. I went to see it. I was like, he lives in The
Yeah,
Hague.
you send
You
pictures on
know,
the WhatsApp group, and
yeah,
it was a
yeah,
trigger for me. I
yeah, right,
I didn't
right,
read the book, outs- our WhatsApp group. I didn't read it for a while, and
right.
then okay,
Well, do you know, it's funny because actually, when I sent a couple of pictures of my new nephew on the group, there was a part of me that thought, shit, should I be sending pictures of my brother's baby in our single child-free community? But actually, I thought, no, you know, it's the kind of place where you can do that because nobody would think, oh my God, how dare she do that? Do you know what I mean? It's just that, like
yeah,
there's so
and
much
yeah,
nuance and it's
and
like
it was for me. It was a good exercise because I got to experience a trigger without
yeah,
having to engage, like
yeah,
you have to
yeah,
do in other situations of life. It's okay, this
yeah,
hurts. I'm going to attend my wound so I
yeah,
can show up better the next time. For me, it's going to sound awful, but it was a great opportunity to deal with a trigger, to
right,
see myself. Why is it hurting you still?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I don't think grief completely goes away. I for at least for childless, because people
yeah,
keep having babies and you're not a mother, you're not a grandmother.
yeah,
But as you say, it is a choice, and the fifth stage of grief is acceptance. And I found myself
yeah,
there, and I said, okay, now what? What do I do with
yeah,
my life? And I couldn't find anyone talking about that.
yeah,
Actually, the ones that I really encountered were traveling nonstop. And I think that is not a way to cope because they don't find with themselves. And at some
yeah,
point, the trip has to stop and you need to go home.
right, yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to be happy in my everyday life first.
Yeah. And I think the thing about it is, especially when it comes to the childless aspect, is that, again, it comes back to what story are you going to continue to tell yourself? And that's where you do have to make a choice, because and what I mean by that is you have to ask yourself, am I going to allow this to define the rest
Yeah.
of my life? And again, that is, going back to what we were talking about, that sort of victimhood. Like, am I going to allow the fact that I haven't been able to have kids, or I haven't ended up having kids, or whatever the reason, am I going to allow that to define how I live the rest of my life?
Yeah.
Because it's possible to continue to feel grief in the same way that, as I've talked about in the podcast, in the same way that I continue to feel pain about not having had kids. Not particularly badly, but it does happen to me. I've been very open about that. When I went to visit my brother's baby, there was a part of me that felt incredibly sad and, oh my God, and I'm still feeling really broody. But you can feel that, you can feel all of those things, and you can still love your life,
Yeah.
and you can still move forward, and you can still find other things to pursue and fulfill you. Because even if you feel like being a mother was the thing that you came to this planet to do, you know, we all have other things that we can explore in our lives. And that is where it does come down to the
Yeah.
choice.
And
Not easy. Not
nurturing is not just for mothers. You
easy.
can nurture
Yeah.
your
Get a
pets
cat.
or yeah, your
That's
plants.
what I've
You
done.
or even volunteer as a non-NG thing with kids and nurture those
Yeah.
kids. It
Yeah.
doesn't like life doesn't stop because something you wanted didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we have to realize, that if that we have to choose whether we are going to allow it to stop us in our tracks and define the rest of our lives, or whether we want to move through that. And like you say, nurturing comes in so many different forms. It doesn't have to be your own baby. And I mean, like, joking aside, when I got my cat Johnny, like I
I
didn't I
love
didn't
him.
get him. Oh my God, I'm obsessed with him. Like, he's the
He's
cutest thing ever.
gorgeous.
He's just he's too much. I can't take it. But no, I didn't get him as some kind of replacement baby. Really, that's not how it came about at all. But when I got him, I very quickly realized that I was, this sort of maternal energy and this maternal instinct was like pouring out of me
Yeah.
onto this poor cat, and continues to do so on a daily, hourly basis. And actually, it's been so lovely, and it is so lovely to have this little being that I am able to mother and nurture and just love and adore. And the great thing about cats is that they're just like toddlers forever, because they never grow up into adults, really.
Yeah.
So, you get the toddler stage for longer than you would if you were a parent to an actual human.
I think about that too because I have three pets. The three are rescues, so I didn't like you said, I didn't get them to fill a void. I just found them and okay, they're here and they are toddlers. And I
Yeah.
don't go to that teenage rage and hate
Yeah.
and it's awesome. And I feel that
Totally.
like sometimes one of them is having a nightmare and when I sleep really deep. There's no way in hell I woke up. But if they're having a nightmare of one of them is throwing up, I instantly woke up like, what's
Yeah,
happening? So I, I
totally.
get I get to experience that. Yeah, it's not with a kid, but I get it.
Totally. It's so funny that you say that, because found that with Johnny. I definitely have that mother sense with him,
Yeah.
100%. And he is an outdoor cat, as you know. And sometimes he'll be out at night when I want to go to bed. And I've had it many, many times where, I've kept the window closed, and so he has to meow to come back in. And I know that as soon as I hear that cat's meow, who like you, I also sleep pretty bloody deeply. And I know that as soon as he is at that window, I hear that meow and it wakes me up. And
Yeah,
it's that mother instinct.
yeah,
And it's funny how you can literally sort of have that in relation to a pet. Like it's real. That is real. Like that I've had a few times with him where he's gone off and like disappeared on me and nearly given me a heart attack. And I've just been like, how am I gonna survive? Like that. In
yeah.
fact,
Not
the
knowing
only
what
when I
happened. Yeah, because my
exactly,
cat
what will
is
I
also
do?
outdoors.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And he's done that a few times, and I've gone out looking for him. And one time when he went missing for like hours and hours and hours, longer than he'd ever been missing before, and I was beside myself. I was literally thinking, "Oh my God, I'm gonna have to like I'm gonna end the podcast. I'm gonna end the membership. I can't do anything. If Johnny doesn't come back, I just, my life is
yeah,
over." Um, and anyway, I was wandering around trying to find him, and I can hear, I swear to God, I know that cat's meow from miles away.
yeah.
Like it's like you have that sort of mother's sixth sense. It's so interesting. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I think it's like the cocktail effect when you hear your name in a party and you realize
Yes,
it's for my pets. It's
yes,
like that. I know
yes,
their meow, their different woes.
yeah,
When they
yeah,
are scared, when they are threatened or something like that. Yeah,
yeah,
and
totally. It's amazing,
of
isn't
course,
it?
yeah, and of course, it's not the same as having a child, but people are so against, oh, you can't compare a pet with being a mother. Why is that, need to put us down? Because
I know. Why is
that
that so
happens to
offensive?
us.
Yeah, I know. And actually I really feel like, I mean, if you talk to people with pets, whether or not they have kids, you know, like people can be absolutely devastated when they lose a pet. So I think, people say, oh, it's not the same. Like I'm very I bet I very much treat Johnny like he is my child, and I give him everything that he wants all the time. I feed him about 8 times a day depending on how demanding he's being, and what, he literally demands food. He just has a way of
Yeah.
demanding food. Like, yes, of course, sir, of course, darling. um but I think, oh God, I completely lost my train of thought. What was I saying for that?
About the
Um,
people that complains that we
oh yes, yes, yes.
compare.
But there are. It's funny how when I've had conversations with like some of my friends or family who I think I'm insane because of the love that I have for this cat, and I've had a couple, like I think one of my nephews said to me once, it's only a cat, and I think even my sister said, oh, it's only a cat, and I'm like, what does that even mean? It's only a cat. He is a being with
Yeah.
feeling, who is sensitive, who gets scared and sad and anxious and all of the emotions. And so I think that, yes, of course, a pet is not the same as an adult, as a human baby or human child, but we can love our pets at a true, true, true depth that can be completely devastating when we lose them. And I
Yeah.
know that because I've had conversations with people. In fact, I remember having a woman on this podcast, on not your podcast, my podcast, um, who she lost her cat, and she'd had this cat for 10 years. And I remember her saying to me, she said it took me years to get over it. She said she cried for like every day for like a year. I can completely understand that.
Yeah, me too. And it's sometimes I feel like they are denying our love because they don't
Yeah.
feel that it's real love. And it's so bizarre that someone tells you, how can you love or how can you be happy? And I don't get that. Like, I wouldn't tell
Yeah,
anyone, you're not happy or you are not, that love doesn't count.
yeah,
Why?
totally. I know, totally. Pet love is amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when in the pandemic, in the lockdown, I had COVID. And before I even realized, my cat would sleep here, and she would purr and purr. And that's strange. She never. And then I started to have the symptoms, and it was like, oh, she was healing me. So
She
how
sensed
can,
it.
yeah, how can I not love her?
Totally, totally. And it's amazing how pets, animals know when you're not well. And they will, and like I've had it before where, in the time that I've had Johnny, um, there's been times where I've had like a really down day, or a couple of times. I don't cry very often. Funny enough, I haven't cried very much since I've been single. Funny that. Um, but the few times that I have cried since in the like 2.5 years that I've had him, he will be super affected by that. And animals just are so affected by our emotions. They're so sensitive to our emotions. And
Yeah,
it's so sweet the way they will kind of come up to you when you're sad, literally. It's amazing.
yeah, and different to people, they won't poke you to don't cry, or why
Yeah,
are you angry? They just sit there
yeah,
and let you
yeah,
feel.
yeah, yeah. I know it's amazing.
Well, we are kind of reaching the end because you have another appointment.
I have an
I
interview
could,
for my podcast.
yeah, I could talk to you like all day long. What do you want to say to those who are still in a victimhood mentality, right?
Oh
Whether they
my
are single,
gosh.
childless, or
I think I think I would say to them, you know, try and get really honest with yourself about whether perhaps a part of the issue in why you don't feel great about your life is actually to do with the way that you are thinking. And I mentioned this earlier, and I know it can be very, very triggering, but I think we have to start, until we recognize it in ourselves, we can't do anything about it. Until we recognize and realize that we are in that sort of victim mode, we can't do anything to change it.
mm,
But I would also say, if there is any part of you that is looking to feel better and, wants to kind of up level your life and just, yeah, just feel happier, I would absolutely say, start reading some books, start listening to some podcasts, or, people who talk about self-development type things, because so often it's like we have to, often when we might read a book and it might lead us to a thought, and that might lead to another thought, and you just, it's like you have to sort of open your mind up to possibility, I think. And that's one of the things that this journey that I've been on has really allowed me to do, is really open my mind up to the possibility of life and how much possibility there is out there. I think we live in a society that doesn't really see possibility, because we are expected to go down this particular route, and we're told that this is how life is, this is how things are, this is how things should be, this is what you should do. um but actually, life isn't that simple. There's so much more nuance, there are so many shades of gray, and
yeah.
actually, there is, there basically there are a lot more potential paths that any of us can take. And I think when it comes to not having kids, I would say, if you're feeling really, really, you're sort of feeling those very heavy feelings of grief, and you're really in it, the only thing I would suggest is try and follow your joy, whatever that looks like, whether that is that you love cooking, whether that is that you love walking or being in nature or reading or, hanging out with your cat, whatever it is. Follow your curiosity, follow your joy, and make sure that you are doing something every day that feels good, you
I
know?
I just picture like a ball of yarn and like pulling the string to that
Yeah.
happiness. to the
Yeah, sort
joy.
of pulling all
Yeah,
those layers, it's pulling all of those layers back and,
yeah,
unraveling all the layers of crap that we've sort of had put upon us. But one thing I would love to say to the listeners is that there is no doubt in my mind that even if you did want to have kids and you've ended up not having them for whatever reason, you've still got so much life to live, and your your life does not need to be devoid of joy and happiness. Like there is life beyond that desire to have kids. And I know that from my own experience. But what we've got to do is we have to lean into all the fabulous things about being child free. If you describe, and also describing when you use the word childless, it feels like you are there's the inference is that you are lacking something, which of
yeah,
course, I completely understand that many women feel like that, but it does matter how we label ourselves.
yeah,
Does the words that we use matter, but life doesn't have to be sad for the rest of it because you haven't had kids, because there is so much more that life has to offer, and it's just a question of us really leaning into that and following our joy and finding other things that are going to bring us happiness, because there's not one thing to bring us happiness. Do you know what I mean? There isn't only one thing that can
yeah.
bring any of us happiness.
And
um
I think
yeah.
if I had to, I don't know, gardening is something that brings me a lot of happiness. But if I only had to do gardening all the time, I would absolutely hate it. So I think that painting different colors is what brings joy, not
Yeah,
just focusing on, okay, this is green and that's it.
yeah, yeah. Also, do you know what else? And some people may not think in this same way, which is completely fair enough, but I truly believe that what is meant for you will not miss you.
Yeah.
And being somebody who has ended up, quote unquote, ended up not having kids, now I look back and I can see so clearly that even though I thought I would have them, I can see now that that life wasn't meant for me, you know?
Yeah.
So I think we have to, if we can, try and remember that actually they miss us. And if we've ended up without kids, there is a reason for that. There is a reason for that. When you think of, I try and think that the universe is working in my favor. I talk about this on the podcast. When you think that life is working in your favor, it's such a much better way of thinking of life, rather than thinking that everything's against you and life is working against you and people are out to get you and all the rest of
Yeah,
it. If
it's
you
liberating for me. It's,
Exactly. If you
yeah,
can literally just make that little shift and start to believe that life is working for you and everything is working out for you, it's amazing how your life changes
yeah,
just by shifting the way that you think of it. And again, going back to the whole mindset piece, because I think this is so, so, so beyond important. It is incredible how different life looks when you are just wearing a different lens. You are looking at it through a different lens, and it is simply a question of making the decision that you want to look through a different lens.
yeah,
Like if life that you're seeing before you, if you are not loving it, if you are feeling down, if you are not loving how you're experiencing your life, then start trying to look at it through a different lens, because two people living the exact same lives can perceive the world completely differently. One
yeah.
of them can see it as the biggest shit show and be miserable and hate it, and the other person can see it as just this wonderful thing.